Good morning and welcome to Green at Core. I sat down to prepare and write this sermon the day after the new lockdown measures were announced. As I began to look at this theme of covenant and what it means for us today as God's people, I started to get a line of a song running through my head. A seemingly unrelated song. The line was the line of a Christmas carol that we'd pinned all our thoughts on over the Christmas period. The line comes from the song O Holy Night, and it says, "A thrill of hope, the weary world rejoices." No matter what I did, I couldn't get that song out of my head. So I began to pray and ask God, what has this to do with covenant? And what does it mean this morning when the world seems pretty hopeless for so many, and we all seem a little bit weary? As I did, God showed me something that quietened so much of the doubt and fear that I had been experiencing. God showed me a picture of my relationship with my husband, Paul. When I first met him and we began our romance, everything was new, everything was exciting and full of hope. Every time I saw his name on the screen of my phone, I got butterflies in my tummy, and I cherished every single moment we spent together. There was a thrill of hope. When I committed to him as my partner, I didn't realise the full extent, depth, and richness of joy that would come. Some might say I didn't know what I was letting myself in for. When we got married, we sealed our covenantal vow to each other. In fact, I walked down the aisle to the band piece procession to covenant. Now, this covenant has been tested in so many ways throughout our years, through grief, sickness, infertility, uncertainty, and even through our rough edges, like snoring, the consumption of things in the treat cupboards, and our musical tastes. For us, however, the fact we're in a covenantal relationship means that through it all, the rough, the smooth, and the seemingly impossible, our situation doesn't change. It may not be all hearts and butterflies of a new romance. However, it's something deeper and far more powerful. I think this analogy of relationship is true for our relationship with God. When Jesus came, there was a thrill of hope, which was amazing and exactly what the world needed. When we first come to know God, there is that thrill of hope as we understand how God is romancing us and pursuing us so that we might be in relationship with him. However, with our commitment to him, with our covenant relationship with him, this thrill of hope gives way to a deep hope. The hope that is the anchor of the soul. A hope that reminds us through the good times and the bad times, through grief, through loneliness, through lockdown. At the moment, many of us are struggling with things that may put our covenantal relationship to the test. However, I encourage you to rest assured that God's covenant with us, his people, means he will always love us, he will always care, and he always wants what's best for us, even when we don't understand. This hope that is found through our covenantal relationship with God is something we can cling to in the midst of any uncertainty that we face. So with all this in mind, we're going to continue the series that our territorial leaders so beautifully began, all about covenant and being God's people here today. This morning, we're going to look at the definitive covenant that God gave his people in the Old Testament, and it's found in Exodus chapter 19, verses 1 to 8. On the first day of the third month, after the Israelites left Egypt, on that very day they came to the desert of Sinai. After they set out from Rephidim, they entered the desert of Sinai, and Israel camped there in the desert in front of the mountain. Then Moses went up to God, and the Lord called him from the mountain and said, "This is what you are to say to the descendants of Jacob, and what you are to tell the people of Israel. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now if you obey me fully and keep my covenants, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, You will be for me a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites." So Moses went back and summoned the elders of the people and set before them all the words the Lord had commanded him. The people all responded together, "We will do everything the Lord has said." So Moses brought their answer back to the Lord. This morning, I want to consider this covenant that was made and briefly look at the three of the main themes that emerge. I also want to take a moment to consider what this means for us here in 2021 as we wrestle with the current situation that we're in. Now, this interaction that we just read takes place after the Hebrew people had escaped from slavery in Egypt and were living in the wilderness. It's at this point that God now begins to talk to his people through Moses to establish a covenant agreement with them. And here we see our first key idea: God's initiative and his eagle's wings. God asked Moses to remind the people of how they were rescued from Egypt. He was reminding them of all that he has done for them and for God's people, and that would mean recalling both the good and the bad memories. Many of these memories we see in the book of Exodus. And in Exodus 3 verse 7, we see that God was listening when his people were struggling. The Lord said, "I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I've heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I'm concerned about their suffering. So I've come down to rescue them from the hands of the Egyptians and to bring them out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey." We know that Moses then went to speak to Pharaoh to ask that God's people were let go. Pharaoh says no, and life is made even more difficult for God's people. They responded by blaming Moses. Then follow the plagues. At the final plague, the death of the firstborn, God gives very specific instructions to his people, and then the people make their escape. Now, this escape involves a high-speed chase, a miraculous parting of a body of water, and the destruction of the enemy's armies. What a memory. However, they will have also been reminded of a memory of how not long after this miraculous event, the Israelites began to grumble and complain. And in verse 16, verse 3, we read, "The Israelites said to them, 'If only we died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around and ate all the food we wanted. But you've brought us into this desert to starve the entire assembly to death.'" Not long after this, we read in chapter 17, verses 2 to 3, "So they quarrelled with Moses and said, 'Give us water to drink.' Moses replied, 'Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you put the Lord to the test?' But the people were thirsty for water there, and they grumbled against Moses. They said, 'Why do you bring us up out of Egypt to make us, our children and livestock die of thirst?' Each time the people complained and grumbled, the Lord still provided for them, and God wanted them to be reminded of that. Following the request of God to remind his people how he had rescued them, he paints a beautiful picture as he talks of how he carried his people on eagle's wings and brought them to himself. Regardless of their attitude and complaints, he still carried them and brought them closer to himself. The love that God feels towards his people is a love that goes beyond our actions towards him. Even though the people didn't understand, God's love remained. Even when the people complained, God's love remained. Even though it seemed like the people's love for God had waned, God's love remained. The kind of love seen in the covenant with his people is the Hebrew word hesed. Now, this love is about commitment, and in the English language it may be described as loving kindness, steadfast love, loyal love, or unfailing love. A quote I came across by an unknown author says this: "Hesed is not merely love, but loyal love. Not merely kindness, but dependable kindness. Not merely affection, but affection that has committed itself." This love is the nearest to grace that we find in the Old Testament, And Isaiah sums it up when he says in 54 verse 10, "Even if the mountains were to crumble and the hills disappear, my heart of steadfast, faithful love will never leave you, and my covenant of peace will never be shaken," says Yahweh, whose love and compassion will never give up on you. Now this leads us on to our second observation, God's commandments and our obedience. Even though God's covenant is everlasting and faithful, it's designed to be kept in relationship. The relationship is two-way, where God's people come before him, declare him their only God, and seek to worship him in and through their lives. Exodus 19 verse 5 says, "Now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all the nations you will be my treasured possessions." This exchange comes immediately before the giving of the Ten Commandments. Now this gave people an idea of what obedience in a covenant relationship might look like. In today's society, many of these commandments are seen as a reflection of good living, but in the days that these were given, they were radical, and they'd have been a challenge for God's people. Now if you need any proof of this, you only have to read about the sight that is before Moses as he comes down the mountain with the Ten Commandments, and he sees his people worshipping a golden calf, directly coming against the very first commandments. Covenant relationship isn't always easy, but it is always worth it. Now the third observation is God's holy covenant of love. Ultimately, in his covenant, we see God's people were being called to one in which they were encouraged to behave, to look like, and to reflect God. This would be done by them being set apart from this world, or holy. Now this is reflected in verses 5 and 6 of our passage. "Now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all the nations you'll be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." However, in our quest to be a holy people, God's people can become too aware and easily caught up in the things that we haven't done or where we might have missed the mark. We can become too distracted to look at all the ways we're moving forward in holiness and becoming more like him. If God's holy, Hesed covenant love is constant, unfailing love and forgiveness, and we're called to look like him, then our holiness in this world should be seen through being actively generous, sacrificial, merciful, and loving with an unfailing love. This means that we love our brothers and sisters in Christ, that we love those who don't know him yet, and we should also love ourselves in the right way. This is something that I would suggest the world really needs to see right now. As the people in the time of Moses were called to this, we too, as God's holy and chosen people, are called to be like this too. Now, in conclusion this morning, I'd like to return to an image that we've just looked at briefly. I believe this image is one of our covenant gods, and he wants to share it with us today. This is the image of God carrying us on eagle's wings. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm feeling pretty tired of the world right now. It can be so easy to be overcome with doubt, fear, grumbling and complaints like the Israelites and giving in to worry. But like the Israelites, God promises to look after us and that we will have strength to get through the things we are facing today. So, as God's covenant people, let's take time this morning to listen and soak in these verses from Isaiah chapter 40, as they are for you. Don't you know anything? Haven't you been listening? God doesn't come and go. God lasts. He's a creator of all you can see or imagine. He doesn't get tired out, doesn't pause to catch his breath, and he knows everything, inside and out. He energises those who get tired. He gives fresh strength to dropouts. For even young people tire and drop out. Young folk in their prime stumble and fall. But those who wait upon God get fresh strength. They spread their wings and they soar like eagles. They run and don't get tired. They walk and don't lag behind. Amen.